Thanks so much for joining me on a not as rainy Saturday afternoon as they had kind of threatened us with, but I'm glad that you're here for this special presentation. My name is Kevin Gray. I am the manager of arts education here at Fenimore Art Museum. And I know this is kind of a niche subject, so I'm glad that you're all here and interested in this topic. And before we get into the presentation, I just want to thank our docent, Tim Gibson, who has promised he will come in to see the presentation. The Japanese prints that are in the frames over there, those are original Japanese woodblock prints that are part of his collection that he wanted to make sure you had a chance to see examples of. So after the talk, if you want to go up there and take a look, you're more than welcome to. And then, of course, if you're famished, after the talk, we do have some delicious traditional Japanese snacks for you to partake in with pretty good descriptions of what they are here on this sheet. But they're all interesting, they're all wonderful, so go ahead and try those out. I also want to thank our curator, Ann Cannon, who put together the exhibition upstairs that I hope you've all had a chance to see. Mary Cassatt, Bert Morisot, Allies in Impressionism. It's an incredible show, and it's because of that exhibition that I have the excuse to give this presentation that I'm going to be giving to you today. So, without any further ado, let me see if I can dim the lights here, and we'll get started. Okay, so this presentation is about the influence of Japanese art and culture on European art during the 1800s. It's much more prevalent and much more important than a lot of us here in America realize. It had ramifications across not just fine art, but the decorative arts, architecture, music, every aspect, clothing, every aspect of our cultural lives. And what I want to try to do this afternoon is kind of highlight how this Japanese influence happened, give a little bit of the backstory leading up to this influence, and then talk about some of the artists during the late 1800s who were extremely inspired by Japanese art. So, but to start with, get my remote control working here. The term itself, Japonisme, basically it's defined as to designate a new field of study of artistic, historic, and ethnographic borrowings from Japan. It's a term that was coined by French art critic Philippe Berti in 1872. And at this point, Japanese art had really kind of scattered throughout the entirety of French art and culture. The little etching you see here on the left is done by an artist named, oh boy, that's French, I'm terrible with French, so I'm not even going to try. This wonderful artist gentleman right here, who created a book of 10 etchings based on Japanese objects that were in the collection of Philippe Berti. So these items that you see here were actually items that Berti himself collected from Japan because he himself was very much part of Japonisme. So that's basically what the term means. And when we think about what's going on today, as myself, as a Gen Xer, millennials in particular, there has been another major resurgence of Japanese art and culture that has been just permeating the entirety of our culture. Everything from, Pokemon encompasses video games, anime, comic books, and it's about 16 other things. But you also have, movies that are now winning Academy Awards. Godzilla is a major part of our culture now as well. And if you've been to any Barnes & Noble in the past 5 to 10 years or so, you know that the manga selection at Barnes & Noble keeps growing every single year and taking up more and more of the bookstore. In fact, I would say that there's probably, maybe half the 10 to 15-year-olds out there are, for their own pleasure reading, are reading from right to left instead of left to right because of these Japanese manga. If you haven't picked up, Japanese manga is basically a Japanese comic book. And to kind of keep the tradition of the story and not have to shift the pages around, when they're translated, they are kept in their original Japanese right to left orientation. So you start from what we would consider the back of the book and go this way and read right to left, up to down. So, you know, it's really become a very crucial and kind of integral part of, you know, Gen X, millennials, whatever the next generation is going to be. So it's happening again. So I feel like this is a good kind of conversation to have. And just kind of bleeding off of that, I've given this presentation a couple times before, but never at a museum. The last 2 times I gave a presentation on this, it was at major anime conventions here in the United States. Otakon is a major convention that's happened the last, gosh, I think going on 35, 40 years, where about 30 to 40,000 people go to now every single year. And it's all about Japanese culture, anime, manga. I didn't have 30,000 people in my talk, which I'm actually kind of thankful for. That would be terrifying. But, and Katsukan. So there's many conventions based on anime and Japanese culture happening all across not just the United States, but Canada and other places. And so this is becoming a thing that people are very, very interested in. So again, I'm thrilled that I got to give this talk here at the museum finally. And we're going to start with a piece that I feel like, yeah, even if you know nothing about Japanese art, you've seen this before. It's probably the most famous Japanese print in existence. It is The Great Wave off Kanagawa by Hatsushika Hakusai from 1831. This was part of a series of prints called The 36 Views of Mount Fuji. What he wanted to do was to travel to different parts of Japan where Mount Fuji could be viewed and showcase that scene from those different vantage points. This one, because of the drama of it, because of that beautiful curve of the wave, because of the, you know, these boats that are getting just torn apart by this massive storm, and how Mount Fuji is just like a little, you know, piece of the background here. It's really the story of these sailors here on this ship, but it just has this beautiful effect, and it's very kind of descriptive of what Japanese prints were during this time period. Here is another one from this 36 Views of Mount Fuji series. Perhaps you've seen this one before as well. You can see this windstorm that's happening here at Yajiri Station in the province of Suruga, and you can see all these people's papers kind of blowing off in the wind. But it's a great example of what Japanese art is all about from, you know, the 1600s going up through the 1800s. This idea of very simple composition, bold lines, bold colors, a flattening of the plane. There is still a little bit of depth here, but overall it's very flat from foreground to background. And just almost graphic in its quality, like a poster or something. Very easy to read, easy to look at, and very simple in its forms. And also, compositionally, not centered. You have objects on the far edges of the page. You have sometimes in these objects that are very, very close to the frame that kind of almost cover the frame. There's a really wonderful example, I didn't put it in here, of a city street where you're literally looking through the horse's feet as a horse comes into town. And the horse's feet are, you know, this big. And then you just have to kind of look around the horse's feet to see the street behind it. It's really interesting compositions that are being done at this time too. And just as an example to show that, you know, we are still being inspired by these types of artworks today, here is an example of a contemporary photographer and his take on this. This is a photographer named Jeff Wall, a Canadian photographer from 1993. Creating his own version of that very print. This is actually an early example of digital photography and Photoshop, so that all those pieces of paper, those are probably all from different photographs and all merged together in an early Photoshopped image. And of course, we also today have contemporary Japanese artists who sometimes make it big on the world stage. Probably the one that is most recognized now would be Yayoi Kusama. Kusama, who I believe now is 96 years old, but she's created these, what we call infinity rooms, where it's a room set up with all of these mirrors so that it looks like it just goes off into infinity. And I love the title of this one, The Spirit of the Pumpkins Descended into the Heavens. It's just a wonderful title. But so there are still Japanese artists today who are making big splashes and big influences on art around the world. But let's go back. Let's jump back to the very beginnings here for our story. The 16th century, this is just a wonderful example of the style of Japanese art during the 16th, 17th century. This is ink, pigment, and gold leaf on paper. It's called Birds and Flowers of the Four Seasons. And again, you can see how the composition is very, very simplified. It's a very flat space, sharp, bold colors, bold lines, and these kind of empty spaces that kind of go through. So it creates a landscape that's almost magical in a way, where it kind of does these amazing things where it almost looks like they're floating. And that's not really by mistake. The Japanese prints that we were looking at here, let me jump back to Hakusai real quick. These were part of a series of prints or a time period when these were called ukiyo-e prints. And ukiyo means the floating world. During this time period, this is the Edo period. This is the era when shoguns were kind of ruling the country. It's a feudal system. But there was relative peace during the 1600s and 1700s under this feudal system. And there was also economic growth and stability. And you had suddenly classes of people, merchants, fishermen, day workers, who were starting to actually build up an income, almost like the middle class today. And they were able finally to start joining in on some of the more, let's say, hedonistic pleasures of the time, everything from geishas to courtesans to going to kabuki theater, these sorts of things. And this hedonistic lifestyle was called the floating world. And this is when you started to have Japanese artists creating artworks that would appeal to this new class of people who are enjoying these new features. So you have woodblock prints of kabuki actors and geishas and all the sorts of things that are happening. And they're printed quite a bit. Quite a few copies are made to the point where they could be sold as low as the price of a bowl of rice. So that almost everybody who could afford a bowl of rice, they could afford a nice woodblock print for their home. And so that's kind of what we're talking about during this time period. And in 1543, we have the very first real contact with Europeans. In 1543, a Portuguese trading ship was driven ashore off the coast of Kyushu in southeast Japan, and it really brought the first trade between Europe and Japan. And here we have this really beautiful artwork, this screen made by Kano Knightson that shows the Portuguese ship reaching the harbor. Let me blow up a section of it here so you can kind of see. I love the way the clothing of the Portuguese sailors is depicted here and the umbrellas and everything else. The Portuguese were able to stay in Japan for about 100 years, and they did some trading. The Japanese got muskets from the Portuguese, and the Portuguese also brought along Christianity. And you had Jesuit preachers who were teaching classes, and in fact, this screen was painted by a Japanese student of these Jesuits who were coming to Japan. And what's interesting is this is called a Namban screen, because the Portuguese were known as Nambanjin by the Japanese, which I don't know whether the Portuguese knew this or not, but Nambanjin actually means southern barbarians. But they definitely had an interesting relationship with the Portuguese. But what happened was, by the early 1600s, the Japanese, who were very much a Shinto religion, kind of an offshoot of Buddhism, they were feeling very threatened by this increase in Christianity. And so they basically kicked Portugal out and put up laws restricting any trade coming into Japan. And this starts the time when Japan becomes largely cut off to the rest of the world. I say largely, though, because there was one other country that was able to start trading with them in the 1600s. Does anybody know what country it was? It was the Netherlands. Exactly, the Dutch. So, the Dutch in the 1600s, or actually in the year 1600, a Dutch ship called the Liefde, which means charity, landed in Bungo, Japan in distress. And it had actually an English captain named William Adams. He was the very first Englishman to enter Japan. And what's interesting is that he got along very, very well with the shogun, the Tokugawa family at the time. And so he was actually asked to stay, and he actually helped the Japanese with teaching them navigation, teaching them mathematics, helping to build 2 ships in the European style, and he actually became a direct retainer to the shogun at the time. So the Dutch were able to keep a relationship going with the Japanese during the 16 and 1700s. William Adams even stayed in Japan. He married a Japanese woman. They had 2 children together. And he was known for really, really loving Japanese clothing and going around wearing a samurai outfit to places that he would go. He really got into it. Here's just an image of William Adams with, it says the emperor in this old 1800s print, but it's actually the shogun. It's mislabeled. So the Dutch are the only ones from 1600 through about 1850 to do any trading with the Japanese. And one of the things that comes from Japan and starts going into the Netherlands is ceramics. This beautiful blue pottery. You would see similar things from China as well. This is a process called sometsuki, which means with dye, and it's basically done with a cobalt glaze that's brushed onto the clay before it's fired, and it turns this beautiful blue color. And if you've ever seen Dutch ceramics, especially like Delft tiles, it's the same process. So we're already seeing this kind of cultural connection, this cultural sharing going on here. But the pottery that came from Japan and China during this time period was already absolutely beloved by so many people in Europe. This is a great quote from the King of Poland from 1670 to 1733, Augustus II. Are you not aware that the same is true for oranges as for porcelain, that once one has had the sickness for one or the other, one can never get enough of the things and wishes to have more and more? I feel the exact same way about oranges. I really do. Of course, we have to remember at this time that oranges were also very much a luxury because they certainly did not grow in Poland. And so to have them imported would have been not cheap. But this gives you an idea right off the bat of the popularity of this porcelain coming from China and Japan with, the wealthy people of Europe. The other decorative art that came from Japan that became very popular during this time was furniture. And not just any furniture, but this lacquered furniture like you see here. That black lacquer, if you've never seen this type of furniture before, that black lacquer is so beautiful and shiny. It has this gloss to it that's just absolutely remarkable. And it's done by refining poison oak sap and using that as the lacquer. And then all of the gold decorations, the gold or silver decorations that you'll see on this are either done by painting extra lacquer on and then using little gold flakes and flaking it on so it sticks to it, or mixing the gold with some lacquer and brushing it on. But this became incredibly, incredibly popular. So popular, in fact, that the Dutch, knowing how expensive this was, there were some Dutch crafters who decided that they were going to try to figure out their own cheaper way of doing it. And they gave their process a name. Maybe some of you have heard it before. It's very clever. It's called Japanning. So this process of creating a cheaper version of this lacquer is a process called Japanning, and that term stuck around for hundreds of years. I do 19th century tintype photography, and in the 1850s, the black metal plates used for tintypes, you would use a process called Japanning to paint those plates black. So this is a term that stuck around for a long time. But we can also see, again, this influence from Japan is getting Europeans, especially here in the Netherlands, to start thinking about, this is a new way to create art. So we have this wonderful quote from a treatise of Japanning and varnishing by Stalker and Parker from 1688. Ancient and modern Rome must now give place. The glory of one country, Japan alone, has exceeded in beauty and magnificence all of the pride of the Vatican at this time and the Pantheon heretofore. That's a big, bold statement for 1688. And while it was true for Stalker and Parker, it wasn't true across the entirety of Europe yet. Europe was still very much ingrained in this idea of neoclassicism. So, at the same time period, we're still getting paintings like this. And I'm not going to go into a whole history of European painting at this time, but just to give you a few examples. This is Fragonard's The Swing from 1767. We still have the columns, the Greek and Roman columns, the putti, this kind of very romanticized style here. You have the historical painting of the time. This is Jacques-Louis David from 1784, Oath of the Horatii, where again, in this case, compositions are very much centered, which is very not Japanese, where your main subjects are off to the side. And this one-point perspective, very different from Japanese art, which is very flat. You don't have this sense of very exacting perspective kind of leading your eye off into the distance, like you see in this painting here. And then eventually, when you get into the 1800s, when we start to get into Romanticism, where the Industrial Revolution is starting to get people to think about, leaving the city and being more one with nature. So like Caspar David Friedrich in 1818. And if you want to talk about Hudson River School, you can go right upstairs to our galleries up on the first floor. So I won't belabor that point. But this is what we start to get into. And this Romanticism in the 1800s will coincide pretty nicely with the huge explosion of Japanese art, which happens in the mid-1800s. But before we get there, one more little detour. I want to go back to this piece real quick, because this beautiful print here, the Great Wave, really could not have been done the way it was done without some help from the Dutch. Does anybody know what the Dutch contributed to make this print the way it is now? Any guesses? It has something to do with a color. You thought you had it. There was one color that was extremely hard to produce naturally. Blue. Blue was extremely hard and difficult to produce. You had ultramarine blue, but that was very, very expensive to make. You had lapis lazuli, which is a stone you could ground up and make blue. But if you had blue in your prints before the Dutch came, you were doing really well as a printer to even have any blue pigment in your prints at all. But the Dutch, or the Europeans, helped create the first synthetic pigment ever created, Prussian blue. And this is Prussian blue. Prussian blue was made with a combination of iron and cyanide that was combined in a very particular way. And you could make this very, very rich blue very, very cheaply. And this Prussian blue pigment came back to Japan, and suddenly you had Japanese printmakers actually competing with each other to see just how much blue they could add to their compositions, because they loved being able to use blue now so much that, again, this wonderful kind of cross-cultural thing that's happening. And of course, Dutch paintings themselves, frankly, I just put this one up because this might be my favorite painting of all time. But we have, Vermeer making portraits like this. We have everyday scenes of Dutch life, like this painting here by Jacob Ochterveld, street musicians at the doorway of a house. And this is another, just like that one we looked at before, a great example of that one-point perspective, of these leading lines and being very kind of mathematical and precise about how these lines all lead us off into the distance here. Very, very European style. And these would have been some of the first European artworks, because it's Dutch, that would have come back to Japan during this time. And talking again about cross-cultural kind of sharing here, there was one Japanese printmaker in particular at the time who loved European art so much that he wrote this. This is from a Japanese artist. Keep this in mind. Shiba Koken. Western painting captures the very soul of creation. Japanese and Chinese paintings are like toys and are of not much practical good. Western painters use light and shade to express contrasting effects, smoothness and roughness, distance and proximity, depth and shallowness. So while we're falling in love with Japanese art, we have Japanese artists who are saying, our stuff sucks. We got to do this. And it's really interesting how that happens. And just as an example of that, Shiba Koken was so inspired by this idea of perspective that this is one of the prints that he made. And you can see that, right? You can see that one-point perspective going right down this archery gallery, right down to where the target is. This is something you rarely see in Japanese art at the time, because Shiba Koken was directly inspired by Europeans. So it's great to see this kind of cross-cultural thing happening again here. But now we'll get to the big one. Here we go. In July of 1853, something major happened in Japan. A crew of 600 men in 2 steamships and 2 sailing boats were led by U.S. Navy Commodore Matthew Perry, and they landed in Japan. There's the man himself. He's like me after I haven't had a couple nights sleep because my daughter keeps me awake. But there he is. And Matthew Perry will be kind and say that he negotiated a few treaties with Japan. The better way to say it would be that he strong-armed a few treaties with Japan that were very, very much more beneficial to America than to Japan. But this is what finally led to the opening of the doors of Japan to the rest of Europe and to America. Here we have this print by an American artist, William Hine, kind of showing the first landing of Americans in Japan. But what happens is, after the Europeans open the door, then you have the Russians and the British and the French. They all come knocking on the door saying, hey, we'd like to trade with you too. Why don't you trade with us now? Here, sign this. And Japan, basically had to relent. We'd had all these soldiers, all these armies coming to Japan. And it really shook up the Japanese government. I'm not going to get too deep into it because it's a very complicated thing. But you have what's called the Meiji Restoration in 1868, where originally Japan was basically run by the shoguns who controlled various sections of Japan. You had an emperor who was more of just like a figurehead. Well, in 1868, the emperor decided that he was going to re-centralize control from the shoguns, get rid of the samurai, change the currency, and basically centralize everything in Japan so that they'd be on a better foothold dealing with all of these new countries that had come to their island. And it really changed the entire government system of Japan and the entire culture as well, in a way. But this is where we start to get a lot more connection between the two. And we start to get some really interesting artwork out of Japan. And I love this one because this is an early Japanese rendition of what they saw an American to look like. Here we have an American drinking and carousing in 1861 by Utagawa Yoshitora, hanging out with a geisha. It's up to you whether you think the placement of the sake bottle is intentional or not in any way. That's up to you. But we have a lot of this going on. And just pop quiz, does anybody want to guess what the first sport America introduced to Japan was? You know what? I knew a lot of you were going to say that. Because baseball is very big in Japan now, but it's not baseball. It's actually horse racing. The interesting story, Ulysses S. Grant went to Japan in 1879 and convinced them to build their very first horse race track. So there you go. Little fun fact for you. But as far as it goes, this in 1867 is when the real kind of Japanese explosion happened in Europe. This is the 1867 Paris exhibition. You had exposition, I should say, not exhibition, exposition. This is, think of it like a World's Fair on steroids. It's massive. It's this huge 6-month-long exposition, this huge fair with dozens of countries participating, showing off what each of their countries has to offer. And this is the first one where Japan participates. And Japan has this little Satsuma pavilion set up here at the exposition. And across these 6 months, over 9 million people come to the exposition to see what's going on there. So you have upwards of 9 million people suddenly being introduced to Japanese culture here at this exposition. And it really changes things. It changes the way people think, the way they see art. So we start to see quotes like this now. It's strange, this revolution brought by Japanese art in the taste of a people who, in matters of art, are the slaves of Greek symmetry, and who suddenly are becoming impassioned over a plate of which the flower is not set dead in the middle. Japan is starting to shake up how we think about composition. And one of the first artists to really get bitten by this Japanese bug is actually this guy. James McNeill Whistler, American artist who spent most of his time in London and Europe. This is his most famous, of course, not titled Whistler's Mother, arrangement in gray and black #1. But Whistler, very early on in the 1860s, starts to massively collect Japanese art, Japanese prints, ceramics, etc. And he starts to make paintings in which he showcases mostly ladies sitting and admiring these exotic pieces that come from the Far East that are now part of these, rich people's households. So you start to see artworks like this. Caprice in purple and gold #2, the golden screen. And this is just an explosion of, everything Japanese here. We've got the screen in the background. She's holding a Japanese print. There's a smattering of them there on the floor. She's wearing probably what is a kimono of some kind. Everything here is just in celebration of Japonisme, even though it doesn't have that term yet, right? Here's another example of Whistler. Yeah, we have the, a fan. We have looks like maybe chrysanthemums down there. Not good with flowers. We have the classic blue ceramic jug up there. And then, of course, we have this one. Rose and Silver, the princess from the land of porcelain. This also starts, when we look at it with a modern eye, the perhaps unfortunate, trend of dressing up white European models in Japanese clothing. But we have her in this kimono with the fan, with the screen. And does anybody know what this painting where this painting was placed? Very important thing that Whistler did. Go down to Washington, D.C. and see it. The Peacock Room. The Peacock Room was a room that was, and this deserves a talk all in and of itself. The story of the making of the Peacock Room is absolutely insane. But it started out with a businessman named Frederick Leland who lived in London and wanted his dining room redesigned so that he could show off his, beautiful Far East treasures, his ceramics and everything else. So he had one artist start it, didn't finish it, brought Whistler in, and Whistler just decided to do whatever the hell he wanted to do without Leyland really approving any of it. And it kind of got a little ornate, and then more ornate, and then it just kind of went crazy. But you can see, the influence of Japanese art on Whistler and creating these peacocks across the walls here that look like Japanese screens and everything else. This is just a wonderful example of that. But this is what we start to get. We start to get this just absolute love and obsession with everything Japanese, Chinese, Asian. We get paintings like this, which is like Japan came in and threw up all over the room. We have, no masks and hanging scrolls and lacquer furniture. Why not throw a leopard rug in there too for no good reason, right? It's all Japanese art everywhere. And then we have artists like, this is my favorite example. This is James Tissot, an artist who really went through a phase. Let's put it that way. So here we have young ladies looking at Japanese objects, and you can see how that entire room is set up like a Japanese kind of room. We have Tissot making young ladies admiring Japanese objects. We have young ladies regarding Japanese objects. And then this is the real revolution for James Tissot next. This is where he really broke new ground. We have young woman holding a Japanese object. And I make fun of just Tissot, but that's okay because the critics, even during that time, kind of made fun of Tissot for doing this over and over and over again. He's like, okay, that's enough. We know you like this stuff. We can move on now. But this is just an example of it. That's what's happening during this time period. And I want to jump back again. I like to anchor everything on this one particular print. Like I said, this was part of a series that Hakusai did called the 36 Views of Mount Fuji. There were multiple prints that were all based on this similar series. Here's another one from this series, which I absolutely love, South Wind, Clear Dawn. And when you start to look at some of these prints and these series, and this was a common thing for Japanese printmakers to make a series of prints based on a theme. That's why we also have 100 views of Edo, which is actually more like 117 views of Edo, but it's all based on the same theme. Then you start to see, finally we're getting to Impressionism, took us long enough. We start to see artists do things like this. We have Claude Monet and his haystacks, right? This is 1891, where he's going and he's painting the same subject from different vantage points at different times of day and making a series. Now, whether it's directly inspired by the Japanese prints that are coming in at this point, I don't know, but there definitely is this similarity in the way that these Impressionist artists and a lot of these Japanese printmakers are kind of looking at the world and kind of creating these series of works all based on a similar theme. And of course, Monet was a huge Japanese art fan. His gardens at Giverny were very much directly influenced by Japanese gardens. He had this bridge constructed in his garden, which is very much a Japanese style bridge. So Monet is obsessed with it. We have many other Impressionist artists who are obsessed with it. Here's a wonderful example of that. This is a Hiroshige print from the 100 Famous Views of Edo, or Tokyo. And here is a quote by Impressionist artist Camille Pizarro about Hiroshige. Hiroshige is a wonderful Impressionist. Monet, Rodin, and I are enthusiastic. How glad I am to have painted the effects of snow and floods. These Japanese artists have confirmed me in our visual judgment. So while the Impressionist artists are breaking away from the Paris Salon and creating this new style of work in which the goal is to focus on color and light and paint, they are looking at these Japanese prints coming from across the pond and saying, this is the work that validates us. We see the similarity here and we connect to it, we love it, and this is what we are striving to do in our own way. There's a real connection here. Another fun pop quiz question for you. What Japanese item was so popular in the West that 16 million of them were imported to Europe and the US in 1891 alone? Anybody want to guess? Okay. Good guess. That's exactly right. I cannot overstate the popularity of Japanese fans in Europe and America in the late 1800s. Forget Pokemon cards. This is where it's at, right here. This is the big popular item. Japan cannot crank these out fast enough for the Europeans during this time. And you saw a bunch in the previous artworks. Here is Claude Monet going a little crazy with fans. This is if you go to the Boston MFA, they have this painting now. This is La Japonaise. It's right there in the name. And this is his wife, Camille, dressed in this very, very elaborate kimono with a kabuki actor stitched on the side of it, surrounded by all of these Japanese fans. And she's wearing a blonde wig, just because, why not? But you can see here just how all of these Impressionists are falling in love. And speaking of fans, this is my favorite part of the story. And this is something that a lot of people don't know about the Impressionists and artists in general during the 1890s. They made artworks designed for fans. They actually painted paintings in this, fan design so that they could be reproduced on fans and printed and sold to people. So we have, this shows Cézanne, Gauguin, Camille Pissarro. I know that Morisot made some. In fact, kind of connecting it upstairs, in 1879, that was the first Impressionist show that Mary Cassatt took part in. I think that was the third Impressionist show. And that was a show that Berthe Morisot did not join, partially because she was pregnant, or she had just given birth and she hadn't had time to make artwork. The only thing that she had time to make were some fan designs. And she didn't want to just submit fan designs to the Impressionist show, so she didn't submit anything that year. So even Morisot was making the fans at this time. And this leads me to one of my favorite quotes in all of art that I discovered by Camille Pissarro, because I feel his pain as an artist and a photographer, and seeing some of the photographs that I personally love versus what people out there love to buy. Pissarro: I had got to churn out fans because times are hard, and for the moment, one can only find a market for them. One mustn't count on paintings. Making stuff for the market just to get by, and that's what it was. People were so enamored by fans, these Japanese fans, that even Impressionist and European artists had to add to the market with their own artworks. I love that. I love that quote. It's so real, right? Okay, moving on. Degas, also, Edgar Degas, very, very influenced by Japanese art. I put this up here because this is a Degas that everybody knows. But here's an example of a Degas that would have probably been inspired by some of these Japanese prints. We'll see why in a little bit. But a lot of Japanese prints, one of the main themes was bathing, people bathing. And so we have this kind of design here by Degas. I also bring up Degas now because Degas and Mary Cassatt, if you don't know, were quite good friends. And it was Degas that invited Mary Cassatt to join the Impressionist exhibition. And so they influenced each other a lot. So now we finally, after 45 minutes, get to Mary Cassatt and Berthe Morisot and our exhibit upstairs, which I hope you get a chance to see later if you haven't already. Here we have Mary Cassatt that's upstairs in the exhibition, Summertime from 1894. And this one definitely has Japanese influence. You can see the flatness of the plane. Even though, we're looking at a woman and a child on a boat, it has this flatness to it, where the top area of water and the bottom area of the water, they look like they're the same distance from us. It's very, very flat in its composition. It's not centered. It has a lot of these tropes that you find in Japanese printmaking, and that's because in 1890, Mary Cassatt saw a major show of Japanese woodblock prints in Paris. This is probably the largest show of Japanese prints to happen to that point. It was a 1-month show. It included over 1,100 prints, including the Great Wave, which we've seen multiple times here. But almost every example of these ukiyo-e prints, these prints from the floating world, geishas, landscapes, nature studies, women and children, which also becomes a main theme for Cassatt and Morisot, right? And after Mary Cassatt sees this show, she immediately writes to her friend Berthe Morisot, "You who want to make color prints wouldn't dream of anything more beautiful. I dream of doing it myself and can't think of anything else but color on copper. P.S. You must see the Japanese. Come as soon as you can." And it's Mary Cassatt that convinces Berthe Morisot to see this exhibition of Japanese woodblock prints, and soon both of them together start experimenting with dry point printmaking. Not prints done with a woodblock, but rather prints where this image is scratched into a piece of copper and then inked and made into a print. And then we have prints like this. And I think, after looking at so many of these Japanese woodblock prints, hopefully you can see the similarity in this style by Mary Cassatt to the Japanese prints that we saw earlier. The flat colors or the flat lines, the bold colors, the flat space, the simple lines that feel very, very graceful. All very, very Japanese, but done with a copper plate rather than woodblock. And it just so happens that this is a print that Mary Cassatt made. This is a print that she owned. This is a Mary Cassatt print from her collection. And you'll even notice the title. This is called The Coiffeur. This one is called Takashima Ohisa Using 2 Mirrors to Observe Her Coiffure. So, inspiration? I think so. And it's interesting what Mary Cassatt thought about the prints that she was making, because she didn't just see it as a side project or an exercise or something just to do that wasn't oil painting. She saw the value in printmaking as a whole, and I don't know if she connected it with the Japanese or not, but she did say this about printmaking: "I believe nothing will inspire a taste for art more than the possibility of having it in the home. I would like to feel that amateurs in America could have an example of my work, a print or an etching, for a few dollars. That is what they do in France. It is not left to the rich alone to buy art. The people, even the poor, have taste and buy according to their means, and here they can always find something they can afford." And in a way, that goes back to that idea of these old ukiyo-e prints being, the same cost as a bowl of rice, being able to afford it for your own home. So I love that there's that connection there, even if it's not necessarily, an intentional connection, but there's that same kind of mindset about allowing the general public to own an important piece or, an actual piece of fine art. And of course, Berthe Morisot is also making prints at this time. And here we have, a woman preparing herself in the toilette. And I compare that to another one of the pieces that would have been in this major show in 1890. This is Public Bath from Manga Volume 1 by Katsushika Hakusai. Now, when it says manga in the 1800s and 1700s was different than what we think of in the bookstores today. It wasn't the kind of Japanese comic books with a story. It was more like a sketchbook of prints based on a similar theme. So in this case, it was a book of woodblock prints all on the theme of public baths. And so here we have an example of that. But you can see again the kind of similarities that are happening here. And just to hit it, really hammer it home, here's another example, The Letter by Mary Cassatt. Unfortunately, it's not in our exhibition, but it is one of the most famous prints that she ever made. And then a Japanese print to go alongside it. And again, you can really see the similarities, not just in subject matter, but in style as well. And then, of course, that comes to America, too. I'm almost done. There's a lot I wanted to go over in this, so I apologize. William Merritt Chase, whose painting we have right upstairs. William Merritt Chase was not only an important American painter, an important American art instructor, and he also was very much influenced by Japanese art. And we can see that here in this painting from 1885 with the kimono. All right, Van Gogh. Mr. Van Gogh. Very, very influential, very important, very beloved. Also very much a fan of Japanese art. So much a fan, in fact, that he did a few copies of some of the prints in his collection. This is on the right, that is Vincent van Gogh's oil-painted version of this woodblock print, even featuring nonsense Japanese text written around the outside of it. Here's another example. This is a Japanese print from Hiroshige, and here is Van Gogh's interpretation of it. He was literally directly inspired by Japanese art. However, not everybody loved it. I had to add this quote as well because we will talk about Frank Lloyd Wright in just a second. Frank Lloyd Wright happened to see these prints later on, and here's his quote. "There's the one that Van Gogh has copied after Hiroshige," he called it, "but I couldn't see that it was anything but just an oil painting of this print. I don't think he did a very good job of it either. The print was so far superior that it was too bad to look at what he did." Everyone's a critic, even Frank Lloyd Wright, I tell you. But just to show you the extent of how much Van Gogh loved Japanese art, it gets a little scary. So this is, and I apologize for the watermarks on this, this is the only real good image I could find. In 1888, Paul Gauguin, as you know, a good friend of Vincent van Gogh, gave Van Gogh a book titled Madame Chrysanthemum, which is basically a story that's kind of a precursor to the opera Madame Butterfly. It's set in Japan. And in the book were these illustrations of bonza, or Japanese Buddhist monks. And traditionally, Japanese Buddhist monks have these shaved heads. This is how they are portrayed. And so, as kind of a thank you to Gauguin for giving him this book and influencing him on the Japanese, Van Gogh decided to make a self-portrait for Gauguin in the style of a Japanese bonza, with a pretend shaved head and, unfortunately, even some slightly slanted eyes, which are not by accident. He didn't mean any harm for this, of course. He was just very infatuated with Japanese. But this is something that, today is a little bit cringe-worthy, right? But back then, it was his way of showing his love for the Japanese. Although Van Gogh's, some of his statements on Japanese are also a little questionable. Like, this is one of his quotes. "Come now, isn't it almost an actual religion which these simple Japanese teach us, who live in nature as though they themselves are flowers?" A little patronizing, but again, he was still very much obsessed with Japanese art, but the way he expressed it sometimes maybe wasn't the best. There were other artists, though, who didn't want anything to do with Japanese art. Renoir, another famous impressionist, had this quote: "Japanese prints are certainly very interesting as Japanese prints. In other words, as long as they stay in Japan. A people should not appropriate what belongs to another race. In so doing, they are apt to make stupid mistakes. There would soon be a kind of universal art without any individual characteristics." See, he was a bit of a hardliner on the other side. But at the same time, this Japanese influence, whether he wanted it to or not, was still bleeding into his own work. So, and I would say that we're not quite at a universal art yet, even in 2025, thankfully. And then just to kind of wrap things up, because my gosh, okay. Going beyond the Impressionists, Japanese influence continues on beyond Impressionism and goes into advertising, right? So this is a French ad from 1891, and you can already see similarities here. And there is a wonderful quote from a critic. Say, "Take any representative Japanese print, a book illustration, a broadsheet, or a theater bill, and it will be found to embody all that a good poster should. One dominant idea is presented graphically, beautifully. The detail does not weaken, but actually enforces the motif." This very bold color, the simple lines, the very kind of, I don't want to call it abstract, but very simplified composition where everything just feels very bold and easy to read, becomes very much what advertising and posters strive for. So here's just quickly an example of a Japanese print from 1767. Very simple shapes, very bold lines and colors, and then a Toulouse-Lautrec. And you can see the exact same kind of thing going on here. This is one of my favorite examples. Here is a print from 1794, Servant on the Veranda of the Restaurant Nakataya, by a printer named Utamaro, or artist named Utamaro. The printer would have been somebody else. And then Toulouse-Lautrec. These dark shapes, these kind of, the use of negative space too. And if you're not yet convinced, Toulouse-Lautrec, also very much fan of the Japanese. Here is a photograph of Toulouse-Lautrec. Yeah. Again, a little bit cringe, but I think that it kind of shows you just how obsessed he was with the Japanese at this point. And he even had himself a stamp. Like you'd have for a Japanese printmaker would have their own stamp with their signature. He had his own stamp created so that he could stamp his artwork. So he, again, very much all in with the Japanese. And then finally, we will talk about, quickly, architecture. And one architect in particular. So this is the Japanese pavilion at the Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. This beautiful structure was seen by, again, millions of people who came to the exposition. One of those people was a young architect named, we saw his name earlier, Frank Lloyd Wright. And he was directly inspired by especially the deep roof overhangs and the emphasis on horizontal lines and the lightweight timber that was used for Japanese structures and architecture. And he started to make his own examples of that. And also the way that architecture is integrated into nature in Japan, which of course leads us to a piece like this, which a lot of people know. This is Falling Waters. But finally, I'll end the show with one final quote from Frank Lloyd Wright, because I think it really is the strongest quote out of all these artists about how much they thought the Japanese art affected them as artists. Here's Frank Lloyd Wright's quote. "Ever since I discovered the print, Japan has appealed to me as the most romantic, artistic nature-inspired country on the earth. If Japanese prints were to be deducted from my education, I don't know what the direction the whole might have taken." So there's Frank Lloyd Wright, almost giving his entire career the credit to Japan. And so I think that's a great way to kind of end the presentation. We could go on into Art Deco, which is also inspired by Japan, and then go into post-World War II and all of that, but we don't have time for that. If you are interested in this subject, though, there's two books that were really helpful to me, especially the one on the right. That is a wonderful book. If you go to Amazon and just type in Japonisme, that's probably the first one that comes up. Great examples, and it goes a lot more into like the decorative arts than I did in this presentation too. So, highly recommended books. Thank you, everybody.